The Ransomes had been burgled. Robbed, Mrs. Ransome said. Burgled, Mr. Ransome corrected. Premises were burgled, persons were robbed. Mr. Ransome was a solicitor by profession and thought words mattered, though burgled was the wrong word too. Burglars select, they pick, they remove one item and ignore others. There is a limit to what burglars can take. They seldom take easy chairs, for example, and even more seldom settees. These burglars did. They took everything. The Ransomes had been to the opera, to così fan tutte, or così, as Mrs. Ransome had learned to call it. Mozart played an important part in their marriage. They had no children, and but for Mozart would probably have split up years ago. Mr. Ransome always took a bath when he came home from work, and then he had his supper. After supper he took another bath, this time in Mozart. He wallowed in Mozart. He luxuriated in him. He let the little Viennese soak away all the dirt and disgustingness he had had to sit through in his office all day. On this particular evening he had been to the public baths, Covent Garden, where their seats were immediately behind the Home Secretary. He too was taking a bath and washing away the cares of his day, cares, if only in the form of a statistic, that were about to include the Ransomes. On a normal evening, though, Mr. Ransome shared his bath with no one, Mozart coming personalised via his headphones and a stack of complex and finely balanced stereo equipment Mrs. Ransome was never allowed to touch. She blamed the stereo for the burglary, as that was what the robbers were probably after in the first place. The theft of stereos is common. The theft of fitted carpets is not. It had not been much of a così. Mrs. Ransome could not follow the plot, and Mr. Ransome, who never tried, found the performance did not compare with the 4 recordings he possessed of the work. The acting he invariably found distracting. "None of them knows what to do with their arms," he said to his wife in the interval. Mrs. Ransome thought it probably went further than their arms, but did not say so. She was wondering if the casserole she'd left in the oven would get too dry at gas mark 4. Perhaps 3 would have been better. Dry it may well have been, but there was no need to have worried. The thieves took the oven and the casserole with it. The Ransomes lived in an Edwardian block of flats the colour of oxblood, not far from Regent's Park. It was handy for the city, though Mrs. Ransome would have preferred something further out, seeing herself with a trug in a garden vaguely. They had no neighbours to speak of, or seldom two. Occasionally they would run into people in the lift, and both parties smiled cautiously, and once they'd asked some newcomers on their floor round to sherry, but he had turned out to be what he called a big band freak, and she had been a dental receptionist with a timeshare in Portugal, so one way and another it had been an awkward evening, and they had never repeated the experience. These days the turnover of tenants seemed increasingly rapid, and the lift more and more wayward. When the Ransomes moved into Naseby Mansions, the flats had boasted a commissionaire in a plum-coloured uniform that matched the colour of the building. He had died one afternoon in 1982 as he was hailing a taxi for Mrs. Brayborn on the second floor, who had foregone it in order to let it take him to hospital. None of his successors had shown the same zeal in office or pride in their uniform, and eventually the function of commissionaire had merged with that of caretaker, who was never to be found on the door, and seldom to be found anywhere, his lair a hot scullery behind the boiler-room, where he slept much of the day in an armchair that had been thrown out by one of the tenants. The police came round eventually, though there was more to it than picking up the phone. The thieves had done that anyway, all 3 phones in fact, neatly snipping off the wire flush with the skirting board, so that with no answer from the flat opposite, sharing time in Portugal probably, Mr. Ransome said, or at a big band concert, he was forced to sally forth in search of a phone box. The pubs had closed. The only place open a launderette, with in the window a payphone. This struck Mr. Ransome as a stroke of luck. Never having had cause to use such an establishment, he had not realised that washing clothes ran to such a facility, but being new to laundrettes, meant also that he was not certain if someone who was not actually washing clothes was permitted to take advantage of it. However, the phone was currently being used by the sole occupant of the place, an old lady in 2 overcoats, who had plainly not laundered her clothes for some time, so Mr. Ransome took courage. "Could you hurry, please?" Mr. Ransome said. "This is an emergency." "So is this, dear," said the woman. "I'm calling Patstow, only they're not answering." "I want to call the police," said Mr. Ransome. "Been attacked, have you?" said the woman. "I was attacked last week. It's par for the course these days. He was only a toddler. It's ringing, but there's a long corridor. They tend to have a hot drink about this time. They're nuns," she said helpfully. "Can't it wait?" asked Mr. Ransome, seeing his effects halfway up the M1. "Speed is of the essence." "I know," said the old lady, "whereas nuns have got all the time in the world. That's the beauty of it, except when it comes to answering the phone. I aim to go on retreat there in May." "But it's only February," Mr. Ransome said. "They get booked up," explained the old lady. "There's no talking, and 3 meals a day, so do you wonder? I suppose I could ring later, only—" She looked at the coins waiting in Mr. Ransome's hand. "I've put my money in now." Mr. Ransome gave her £1, and she took the other 50p besides, saying, "You don't need money for 999. "Fire, police, or ambulance?" said a woman's voice. "Police," said Mr. Ransome. There was a pause. "I feel better for that banana," said a man's voice. "Yes, police?" Mr. Ransome began to explain, but the man cut him short. "Anyone in danger?" He was chewing. "No," said Mr. Ransome, "but—" "Slight bottleneck at the moment, Chief," said the voice. "Bear with me while I put you on hold." Mr. Ransome found himself listening to a Strauss waltz. "Sorry about that," the voice said 5 minutes later. "We're on manual at the moment. The computer's got hiccups. How may I help you?" Mr. Ransome explained there had been a burglary and gave the address. "Are you on the phone?" "Of course," said Mr. Ransome, "only—" "And the number is—" "They've taken the phone," said Mr. Ransome. "Oh, nothing new there," said the voice. "Cordless job?" "No," said Mr. Ransome. "One was in the sitting-room, one was by the bed—" "We don't want to get bogged down in detail," said the voice. "Besides, the theft of a phone isn't the end of the world. What was the number again?" It was after 1 o'clock when Mr. Ransome got back, and Mrs. Ransome, already beginning to pick up the threads, was in what had been their bedroom, sitting with her back to the wall, in the place where she would have been in bed had there been a bed to be in. She had done a lot of crying while Mr. Ransome was out, but had now wiped her eyes, having decided she was going to make the best of things. "I thought you might be dead," she said. "Why dead?" "Well, it never rains but it pours." Mr. Ransome went to the lavatory, only realising when it was too late that the burglary had been so comprehensive as to have taken in both the toilet roll and its holder. "There's no paper," called Mrs. Ransome. The only paper in the flat was the programme from Cossey, and passing it round the door, Mrs. Ransome saw, not without satisfaction, that Mr. Ransome was going to have to wipe his bottom on a picture of Mozart. Both unwieldy and unyielding, the glossy brochure, sponsored by Barclays Bank plc, was uncomfortable to use and unsinkable afterwards, and 3 flushes notwithstanding, the drowned face of Bernard Haitink still came floating glumly round the bend of the pan. "Better?" said Mrs. Ransome. "No," said her husband, and settled down beside her against the wall. However, finding the skirting board dug into her back, Mrs. Ransome changed her position to lie at right angles to her husband, so that her head now rested on his thigh, a location it had not been in for many a long year. It was 4 o'clock before the police arrived, a big middle-aged man in a raincoat, who said he was a detective sergeant, and a sensitive-looking young constable in uniform, who didn't say anything at all. "You've taken your time," said Mr. Ransome. "Yes," said the sergeant. "We would have been earlier, but there was a slight glitch, as they say. Rang the wrong doorbell, the fault of my laddo here. Saw the name Hanson and—" "No," said Mr. Ransome. "Ransom." "Yes, we established that, eventually." "Just moved in, have you?" said the sergeant, surveying the bare boards. "No," said Mr. Ransome. "We've been here for 30 years. "Fully furnished, was it?" "Of course," said Mr. Ransome. "It was a normal home." "A settee, easy chairs, a clock," said Mrs. Ransome. "We had everything." "Television?" said the constable timidly. "Yes," said Mrs. Ransome. "Only we didn't watch it much," said Mr. Ransome. "Video recorder?" "No," said Mr. Ransome. "Life's complicated enough." "CD player?" "Yes," said Mrs. Ransome and Mr. Ransome together. "And my wife had a fur coat," said Mr. Ransome. "My insurance have a list of the valuables." "In that case," said the sergeant, "you are laughing. I'll just have a little wander round, if you don't mind, while Constable Partridge takes down the details. People opposite see the intruder?" "Away in Portugal," said Mr. Ransome. "Caretaker?" "Probably in Portugal too," said Mr. Ransome, "for all we see of him." "Is it Ransom as in Kings," said the constable, "or Ransom as in Arthur?" "Partridge is one of our graduate entrants," said the sergeant, examining the front door. "I take it you'll want counselling," said the constable. "What?" "Someone comes along and holds your hand," said the sergeant, looking at the window. "Partridge thinks it's important." "We're all human," said the constable. "I'm a solicitor," said Mr. Ransome. "Well," said the sergeant, "perhaps your missus could give it a try. We like to keep Partridge happy." Mrs. Ransome smiled helpfully. "I'll put yes," said the constable. "They didn't leave anything behind, did they?" asked the sergeant, sniffing and reaching up to run his hand along the picture rail. "No," said Mr. Ransome testily, "not a thing, as you can see." "I didn't mean something of yours," said the sergeant. "I meant something of theirs." He sniffed again, inquiringly. "A calling card." A calling card?" said Mrs. Ransome. "Excrement," said the sergeant. "Burglary is a nervous business. They often feel the need to open their bowels when doing a job." "Which is another way of saying it, sergeant," said the constable. "Another way of saying what, Partridge?" "Doing a job is another way of saying opening the bowels. In France," said the constable, "it's known as posting a sentry." "Oh, teach you that at Leatherhead, did they?" said the sergeant. "Partridge is a graduate of the police college." "It's like a university," explained the constable, "only they don't have scarves." "Anyway," said the sergeant, "have a scout round. For the excrement, I mean. Still, while we're talking about bodily functions, before we take our leave, I'll just pay a visit myself." The sergeant came out, shaking his head. "Well, at least our friends have the decency to use the toilet, but they've left it in a disgusting state. I never thought I would have to do a Jimmy Riddle over Dame Kirite Kanawa. Her recording of West Side Story is one of the gems of my record collection." "Do you think you'll catch them?" said Mr. Ransome as he stood at the door with the two policemen. The sergeant laughed. "Well, miracles do happen even in the world of law enforcement. Nobody got a grudge against you, have they?" "I'm a solicitor," said Mr. Ransome. "It's possible. And it's not somebody's idea of a joke." "A joke?" said Mr. Ransome. "Just a thought," said the sergeant. "But if it's your genuine burglar, I'll say this. He always comes back." When he'd gone, and with the flat so empty, Mrs. Ransome missed him a little, wandering from room to echoing room, not sure where she should start. Deciding to make a list, she forgot for the moment she had nothing to make a list with, and nothing to make a list on. This meant a visit to the newsagent's for a pad and pencil, where, though she'd never noticed it before, she found there was a cafe next door. It seemed to be doing hot breakfasts, and though in her opera clothes she felt a bit out of place among the taxi drivers and bicycle couriers who comprised most of the clientele, nobody took much notice of her, the waitress even calling her Duck and offering her a copy of the Mirror to read while she waited for a bacon, egg, baked beans and fried bread. It wasn't a paper she would normally read, but bacon, egg, baked beans and fried bread wasn't a breakfast she would normally eat either, and she got so interested in the paper's tales of royalty and its misdemeanours that she propped it up against the sauce bottle so that she could read and eat, completely forgetting that one of the reasons she had come into the cafe was to make herself a list. Wanting a list, her shopping was pretty haphazard. She went off to Boots first and bought some toilet rolls and some paper plates and cups, but she forgot soap. And when she remembered soap and went back for it, she forgot tea bags. And when she remembered tea bags, she forgot paper towels, until, what with trailing halfway to the flats, then having to go back again, she began to feel worn out. It was on the third of these increasingly flustered trips, now having forgotten plastic cutlery, that Mrs. Ransome ventured into Mr. Anwar's. She had passed the shop many times, as it was midway between the flats and St. John's Wood High Street. Indeed, she remembered it opening, and the little draper's and baby's knitwear shop which it had replaced, and where she had been a loyal customer. That had been kept by a Miss Dorsey, from whom over the years she'd bought the occasional tray-cloth or hank of silko, but on a much more regular basis plain brown paper packets of what in those days were called towels. The closing down of the shop in the late 60s had left Mrs. Ransome anxious and unprotected, and it came as a genuine surprise, on venturing into Timothy White's, to find that technology in this intimate department had lately made great strides, which were unreflected in Miss Dorsey's ancient stock, of which Mrs. Ransome, as the last of a dwindling clientele, had been almost the sole consumer. She was old-fashioned, she knew that, but snobbery had come into it too, Mrs. Ransome feeling it vaguely classier to have her requirements passed wordlessly across the counter with Miss Dorsey's patient, suffering smile. "Ah, cross," it said, rather than taken from some promiscuous shelf in Timothy White's. The closing down of Miss Dorsey's, she was found laid across the counter one afternoon having had a stroke, left the premises briefly empty, until, passing one morning on the way to the High Street, Mrs. Ransome saw that the shop had been taken over by an Asian grocer, and that the pavement in front of the window, where nothing had previously stood except the occasional customer's pram, was now occupied by boxes of unfamiliar vegetables, yams, pawpaws, mangoes, and the like, together with many sacks. Sacks, Mrs. Ransome felt, that dogs could all too easily cock their leg against. So it was partly out of loyalty to the late Miss Dorsey, and partly because it wasn't really her kind of thing, that Mrs. Ransome had not ventured into the shop until this particular morning, when, to save her trailing back for the umpteenth time to the High Street, she thought she might go in and ask if they had such a thing as boot polish. There were more pressing requirements, as she would have been the first to admit, only Mr. Ransome was very particular about his shoes. Though over 20 years had passed, the shop was still recognisably what it had been in Miss Dorsey's day, because, other than having introduced a freezer and coal cupboards, Mr. Anwar had simply adapted the existing fixtures to his changed requirements. Drawers that had previously been devoted to the genteel accoutrements of a leisured life, knitting patterns, crochet hooks, rufflet, now housed naans and pita bread. Spices replaced bonnets and bootees, and the shelves and deep drawers that once were home to hosiery and foundation garments were now filled with rice and chickpeas. Mrs. Ransome thought it unlikely they had polish in stock. Did they wear normal shoes? But she was weary enough to give it a try, though, since oxblood was what she wanted, or Mr. Ransome required, she thought vaguely it might be a shade to which they had religious objections. But plump and cheerful, Mr. Anwar brought out several tins for her kind consideration, and while she was paying she spotted a nail-brush they would be needing. Then the tomatoes looked nice, and there was a lemon, and while she was at it the shop seemed to sell hardware, so she invested in a colander. As she wandered round the shop, the normally tongue-tied Mrs. Ransome found herself explaining to this plump and amiable grocer the circumstances which had led her to the purchase of such an odd assortment of things. And he smiled and shook his head in sympathy, while at the same time suggesting other items she would doubtless be needing to replace, and which he would happily supply. "They cleaned you out of house and home, the scallywags. You will not know whether you are coming or going. You will need washing-up liquid, and one of these blocks to make the toilet a more savoury place." So she ended up buying a dozen or so items, too many for her to carry, but this didn't matter either, as Mr. Anwar fetched his little boy from the flat upstairs. "I hope I'm not dragging him away from the Koran," she thought, and he followed Mrs. Ransome home in his little white cap, carrying her shopping in a cardboard box. "Seconds, probably," said Mr. Ransome later. "That's how they make a profit." Mrs. Ransome didn't quite see how there could be seconds in shoe polish, but didn't say so. "Hopefully," she said, "they'll deliver." "You mean," said Mr. Ransome, and it was old ground, "you hope they'll deliver." "Hopefully they'll deliver" means that deliveries are touch and go, though that was probably true too. "Anyway," said Mrs. Ransome defiantly, "he stays open till 10 at night." "He can afford to," said Mr. Ransome. "He probably pays no wages. I'd stick to Marks and Spencer." Which she did, generally speaking, though once she popped in and bought a mango for her lunch, and another time a pawpaw. Small adventures, it's true, but departures nevertheless, timorous voyages of discovery, which she knew her husband well enough to keep to herself. The Ransomes had few friends. They seldom entertained, Mr. Ransome saying that he saw quite enough of people at work. On the rare occasions where Mrs. Ransome ran into someone she knew and ventured to recount their dreadful experience, she was surprised to find that everyone, it seemed, had their own burglar story. None, she felt, were so stark or so shocking as to measure up to theirs, which ought, in fairness, to have trumped outright these other less flamboyant break-ins. But comparison scarcely seemed to enter into it. The friends only endured her story as an unavoidable prelude to telling her their own. She asked Mr. Ransome if he had noticed this. "Yes," he said shortly. "Anybody would think it happened every day." Which of course it did, but not, he was certain, as definitively, as out-and-outedly, as altogether epically as this. Over the next week or so, Mrs. Ransome assembled the rudiments. 2 camp beds, plus bedding and towels, a card table and 2 folding chairs. She bought a couple of what she called bean bags, though the shop called them something else. They were quite popular, apparently, even among people who had not been burgled, who used them to sit on the floor by choice. There was even, this was Mr. Ransome's contribution, a portable CD player and a recording of the magic flute. Mrs. Ransome had always enjoyed shopping, so this obligatory re-equipment with the essentials of life was not without its pleasures, though the need was so pressing that choice scarcely entered into it. Hitherto, anything electrical had always to be purchased by, or under the supervision of, Mr. Ransome, a sanction that applied even with an appliance like the vacuum cleaner, which he never wielded, or the dishwasher, which he seldom stacked. However, in the special circumstances obtaining after the burglary, Mrs. Ransome found herself licensed to buy whatever was deemed necessary, electrical or otherwise. Not only did she get an electric kettle, she also went in for a microwave oven, an innovation Mr. Ransome had long resisted and did not see the point of. That many of these items, the beanbags for instance, were likely to be discarded once the insurance paid out and they acquired something more permanent, did not diminish Mrs. Ransome's quiet zest in shopping for them. Besides, the second stage was likely to be somewhat delayed, as the insurance policy had been stolen too, together with all their other documents, so compensation, while not in doubt, might be slow in coming. In the meantime they lived a stripped-down sort of life, which seemed to Mrs. Ransome, at least, not unpleasant. "Hand to mouth," said Mr. Ransome. "Living out of a suitcase," said Croucher, his insurance broker. "No," said Mr. Ransome. "We don't have a suitcase." "You don't think," asked Croucher, "it might be some sort of joke?" "People keep saying that," said Mr. Ransome. "Jokes must have changed since my day. I thought they were meant to be funny." "What sort of CD equipment was it?" said Croucher. "Oh, state of the art," said Mr. Ransome. "The latest and the best. I've got the receipt somewhere. Oh, no, of course. I was forgetting." Though this was a genuine slip, it was perhaps fortunate that the receipts had been stolen along with the equipment which they were for, because Mr. Ransome was telling a little lie. His sound equipment was not quite state-of-the-art, as what equipment is. Sound reproduction is not static. Perfection is ongoing, and scarcely a week passes without some technical advance. As an avid reader of hi-fi magazines, Mr. Ransome often saw advertised refinements he would dearly have liked to make part of his listening experience. The burglary, devastating though it had been, was his opportunity. So it was at the moment when he woke up to the potential advantages of his loss that this most unresilient of men began, if grudgingly, to bounce back. Mrs. Ransome, too, could see the cheerful side of things, but then she always did. When they had got married, they had kitted themselves out with all the necessities of a well-run household. They had a dinner service, a tea service, plus table linen to match. They had dessert dishes and trifle glasses and cake stands galore. There were mats for the dressing table, coasters for the coffee table, runners for the dining table, guest towels with matching flannels for the basin, lavatory mats with matching ones for the bath. They had cake slices and fish slices and other slices besides, delicate trowels in silver and bone, the precise function of which Mrs. Ransome had never been able to fathom. Above all, there was a massive, many-tiered canteen of cutlery, stocked with sufficient knives, forks and spoons for a dinner party for 12. Mr. and Mrs. Ransome did not have dinner parties for 12. They did not have dinner parties. They seldom used the guest towels because they never had guests. They had transported this paraphernalia with them across 32 years of marriage to no purpose at all that Mrs. Ransome could see, and now, at a stroke, they were rid of the lot. Without knowing why, and while she was washing up their 2 cups in the sink, Mrs. Ransome suddenly burst out singing. "It's probably best," said Croucher, "to proceed on the assumption that it's gone and isn't going to come back. Maybe someone fancied a well-appointed middle-class home and just took a shortcut." He stood at the door. "I'll get a cheque to you as soon as I can. Then you can start rebuilding your lives. Your good lady seems to be taking it well." "Yes," said Mr. Ransome, "only she keeps it under." "No outstanding jewellery or anything of that sort?" "No, she's never really gone in for that sort of thing," said Mr. Ransome. "Luckily she was wearing her pearls to the opera." "She had a necklace on tonight," said Croucher. "Rather striking, I thought." "Did she?" Mr. Ransome hadn't noticed. When they were at the card table having their supper, Mr. Ransome said, "Have I seen that necklace before?" "No. Do you like it? I bought it at the grocer's." "The grocer's?" "The Indian shop. It was only 75p. I can't wear my pearls all the time. It looks as if it came out of a cracker. I think it suits me. I bought 2. The other one's green." "What am I eating?" said Mr. Ransome. "Swede?" "A sweet potato. Do you like it?" "Where did you get it?" "Marks and Spencer." "It's very nice." A couple of weeks after the burglary, everything now dated from that, Mrs. Ransome was sitting on her beanbag in front of the electric fire, her legs stuck out in front of her, contemplating her now rather scuffed court shoes, and wondering what she ought to do next. Burglary was the same as a death, she thought. So much to do to begin with, then afterwards nothing. Nevertheless, and further to her thoughts at the sink, Mrs. Ransome had begun to see that to be so abruptly parted from all her worldly goods might bring with it benefits she would have hesitated to call spiritual, but which might, more briskly, be put under the heading of improving the character. She would go to museums, she thought, art galleries, learn about the history of London. There were classes in all sorts nowadays. classes which she could perfectly well have attended before they were deprived of everything they had in the world, except that it was everything they had in the world, she felt, that had been holding her back. Now she could start. It was at this point the doorbell rang.
"Hello, my name is Briscoe," the voice said over the intercom. "Your counsellor?"
We're Conservatives," said Mrs. Ransome.
"No," said the voice. "The police? Your trauma? The burglary?"
Knowing the counsellor had come via the police, Mrs. Ransome had expected someone, well, a bit crisper. There was nothing crisp about Miss Briscoe, except possibly her name, and she got rid of that on the doorstep.
No, call me Dusty. Everybody does. Now, you are Mrs. Ransome, Rosemary Ransome."
"Yes."
"And that's what people call you, is it, Rosemary?"
"Well, yes. Insofar as they call me anything," thought Mrs. Ransome.
"Just wondered if it was Rose or Rosie."
"Oh, no."
"Hubby calls you Rosemary, does he?"
"Well, yes," said Mrs. Ransome, "I suppose he does," and went to put the kettle on, thus enabling Dusty to make her first note.
Query: is burglary the real problem here?
They took their tea into the sitting-room, and each sank onto a bean-bag, a manoeuvre Mrs. Ransome was now quite good at, though with Dusty it was more like a tumble.
"Oh, he's new," said Dusty, wiping some tea from her smock. "I was with another client yesterday, the sister of someone who's in a coma, and she had something similar. Now, Rosemary, I want us to try and talk this through together."
Mrs. Ransome wasn't sure whether this was the same as talking it over. One seemed a more rigorous, less meandering version of the other, the difference in their choice of prepositions not boding well for fruitful discourse.
"I know you must be hurting," said Dusty.
"Hurting what?" said Mrs. Ransome.
You were hurting."
Mrs. Ransome considered this, her stoicism simply a question of grammar.
"Oh, you mean I'm hurt? Well, yes and no. I'm getting used to it, I suppose." "Don't get used to it too soon," said Dusty. "Give yourself time to grieve. You did weep at the time, I hope."
"To begin with," said Mrs. Ransome, "but I soon got over it."
"Did Morris?"
"Morris?"
"Mr. Ransome." No, I don't think he did."
"Well," and it was as if she were sharing a secret, "he's a man, you see."
"No, Rosemary. He's a person. It's a pity that he didn't let himself go at the time. The experts are all more or less agreed that if you don't grieve, keep it all bottled up, you're quite likely at some time in the future to go down with cancer."
"Oh, dear," said Mrs. Ransome.
"Of course," said Dusty, "men do find grieving harder than women. Would it help if I had a word?"
"With Mr. Ransome? No," said Mrs. Ransome hastily. "I don't think so. He's very, shy."
"Still," said Dusty, "I think I can help you, or we can help each other."
She leaned over to take Mrs. Ransome's hand, but found she couldn't reach it, so stroked the bean-bag instead.
"They say you feel violated," said Mrs. Ransome. "Yes, let it come, Rosemary, let it come. Only I don't particularly, just mystified."
"Client in denial," Dusty wrote as Mrs. Ransome took away the teacups. Then she added a question mark. As she was going, Dusty suggested that Mrs. Ransome might try to see the whole experience as a learning curve, and that one way the curve might go, it could go several ways apparently, was to view the loss of their possessions as a kind of liberation, the lilies-of-the-field syndrome, as Dusty called it. Lay not up for yourself treasures on earth type thing. This notion having already occurred to Mrs. Ransome, she nevertheless didn't immediately take the point, because Dusty referred to their belongings as their gear,
a word which, if it meant anything to Mrs. Ransome, denoted the contents of her handbag, lipstick, compact, etc., none of which she had in fact lost. Though thinking about it afterwards, she acknowledged that to lump everything, carpets, curtains, furniture and fittings, all under the term gear, did make it easier to handle. Still, it wasn't a word she contemplated risking on her husband. When Mrs. Ransome said to Dusty that she didn't particularly miss her belongings, she had been telling the truth. What she did miss, and this was harder to put into words, was not so much the things themselves as her particular paths through them. There was the green bobble hat she had had, for instance, which she never actually wore, but would always put on the hall table to remind her that she had switched the immersion heater on in the bathroom. She didn't have the bobble hat now, and she didn't have the table to put it on, and that she still had the immersion must be regarded as a providence. But with no bobble hat she'd twice left the immersion on all night, and once Mr. Ransome had scalded his hand. He too had had rituals to forego. He had lost the little curved scissors, for instance, with which he used to cut the hair in his ears, and that was only the beginning of it. While not especially vain, he had a little moustache which, if left to itself, had a distasteful tendency to go ginger, a tinge which Mr. Ransome kept in check with the occasional touch of hair-dye. This came out of an ancient bottle Mrs. Ransome had tried on her roots years ago, and then instantly discarded, but which was still kept at the back of the bathroom cupboard. Locking the bathroom door before applying it to the affected part, Mr. Ransome had never admitted to what he was doing, with Mrs. Ransome in her turn never admitting that she knew about it anyway. Only now the bathroom cupboard was gone, and the bottle with it. So in due course Mr. Ransome's moustache began to take on the telltale orange tinge he found so detestable. Unhappily tracing its progress in Mrs. Ransome's powder compact, kept in the bathroom now as the only mirror in the flat, Mr. Ransome cursed the burglars who'd brought such humiliation upon him, and lying on her camp bed, Mrs. Ransome reflected that not the least of what they had lost in the burglary were these little marital deceptions. Mr. Ransome had been told that while the insurance company would not pay for the temporary rental of a CD player, not regarded as an essential, it would sanction the hire of a TV. So one morning Mrs. Ransome went out and chose the most discreet model she could find, and it was delivered and fitted that same afternoon. She had never watched daytime television before, feeling she ought to have better things to do. However, when he had gone, she found the engineer had left the set switched to some sort of chat show, in which an overweight American couple were being questioned by a black lady in a trouser suit about how, as the black lady put it, they related to one another sexually. The man, slumped in his seat with his legs wide apart, was describing, in as much detail as the woman in the trouser suit would allow, what he, as he put it, asked of his marriage, while the woman, arms folded, knees together, but too plump to be prim, was explaining how, without being judgmental, he had never taken the deodorant on board. "Get a load of that body language," said the lady in the trouser suit, and the audience, mystifyingly to Mrs. Ransome, who did not know what body language was, erupted in jeers and laughter. The things people do for money, thought Mrs. Ransome, and switched it off. The next afternoon, waking from a doze on her beanbag, she switched on again, and found herself watching a similar programme, with another equally shameless couple, and the same hooting, jeering audience, roaming among them with a microphone a different hostess, white this time, but as imperturbable as the first, and just as oblivious to everybody's bad manners, even, it seemed to Mrs. Ransome, egging them on. The presenters and their audience spoke in a language which Mrs. Ransome, to begin with anyway, found hard to understand, talking of parenting and personal interaction and fine-tuning their sex lives, and taking it up the butt. It was a language of avowal and exuberant fellowship. "I hear what you're saying," they said, smacking each other's hands. "I know where you're coming from."
What Mrs. Ransome could never get used to was how unabashed the participants were, how unsheepish, and how none of these people was ever plain shy. Even when there was a programme about shyness, no one who took part was shy, in any sense that Mrs. Ransome understood it. There was no hanging back, and no shortage of unblushing participants willing to stand up and boast of their crippling self-consciousness, and the absurdities to which overwhelming diffidence and self-effacingness had brought them. No matter how private or intimate the topic under discussion, none of these eager, vociferous people had any shame. Still, Mrs. Ransome felt they were all better than she was. For what none of these whooping, giggling, and often quite obese creatures seemed in no doubt about was that at the basic level at which these programmes were pitched, people were all the same. There was no shame and no reserve, and to pretend otherwise was to be stuck up and a hypocrite. Mrs. Ransome felt that she was certainly the first, and that her husband was probably the second. The contents of the flat were insured for £50,000. It had originally been much less, but being a solicitor and a careful man besides, Mr. Ransome had seen to it that the premium had kept pace with the cost of living. Accordingly, this modest agglomeration of household goods, furniture, fixtures and fittings had gone on over the years, gently increasing in value. The stereo and the Magimix, the canteen of cutlery, the EP&S salad servers, the tray cloths and table mats, and all the apparatus of that life which the Ransomes had the complete equipment for, but had never managed to lead, all this had marched comfortably in step with the index. So, at any rate, the insurance company concluded, and in due course a cheque arrived for the full value, plus an unforeseen increment payable in the absence of any previous claims, and which served to cover disruption and compensate for distress. Mrs. Ransome was sitting contentedly in a cheap cane rocking-chair she'd found a few weeks earlier in a furniture store up the Edgware Road. Now that the insurance cheque had come through, she planned on getting a matching chair for Mr. Ransome. Sitting with what Mr. Anwar had told her was an Afghan prayer rug round her shoulders, she felt in the middle of the bare sitting-room floor that she was on a cosy and slightly exotic little island. For the moment, Mr. Ransome's island was not so cosy. Just a chair at the card table on which Mrs. Ransome had put the one letter that constituted the day's post. Mr. Ransome picked up the envelope. "Smelling curry," he said. "What's for supper?" "Curry." Mr. Ransome turned the letter over. It looked like a bill. "What sort of curry?" "Lamb," said Mrs. Ransome, "with apricots." "I've been wondering," she said, "would white be too bold?" "White what?" said Mr. Ransome, holding the letter up to the light. "Well," she said hesitantly, "white everything, really." Mr. Ransome did not reply. He was reading the letter. "You mustn't get too excited," Mr. Ransome said as they were driving towards Aylesbury. "It could be somebody's sense of humour. Another joke." He had telephoned the storage firm that morning to have a girl answer. It was called Rapid and Reliant Removals and Storage. Those n's, Mr. Ransome thought, a foretaste of trouble. Nor was he disappointed. "Rapid and Reliant Removals? Christine speaking. How may I help you?" Mr. Ransome asked for Mr. Ralston, who had signed the letter. "The present time of speaking, Mr. Ralston is in Cardiff. How may I help you?" "When will he be back?" "He's on a tour of repositories, so not until next week. How may I help you?" Her repeated promises of help notwithstanding, Christine had the practised lack of interest of someone perpetually painting her nails, and when Mr. Ransome explained that the previous day he had received a mysterious invoice for £344.36, re the storage of certain household effects, the property of Mr. and Mrs. Ransome, all Christine said was, "And?" He began to explain the circumstances, but at the suggestion that the effects in question might be stolen property, Christine came to life.
May I interject? I think that's very unlikely. I mean, Rapid and Reliant were established in 1977.
Mr. Ransome tried a different tack. You wouldn't happen to know whether any of these household effects you're holding include some old stereo equipment?
If you have any items in storage with Rapid and Reliant, they'll show up on the C-47, of which you should have a copy. It's a yellow flimsy.
Mr. Ransome started to explain why he didn't have a flimsy, but Christine cut him short.
I wouldn't know that, would I, because I'm in Newport Pagnell. This is the office. The storage depot is in Aylesbury. You can be anywhere nowadays, it's computers. Actually, the person who could help you at Aylesbury is Martin, but I happen to know he's out on a job most of today.
I wonder if I ought to go down to Aylesbury, Mr. Ransome said, just to see if there's anything there. Christine was unenthusiastic.
I can't actually stop you, she said. Only they don't have any facilities for visitors. It's not like a kennels, she added inexplicably.
Mr. Ransome having told her the storage firm was in a business park, Mrs. Ransome, who was not familiar with the genre, imagined it situated in a setting agreeably pastoral, a park that was indeed a park, and attached to some more or less stately home, now sensitively adapted to modern requirements. The estate dotted with workshops, possibly, offices nestling discreetly in trees. It was only when she found herself being driven round a bleak, treeless ring road lined with small factories and surrounded by concrete and rough grass that Mrs. Ransome began to revise her expectations.
"It doesn't look very countrified," Mrs. Ransome said.
"Why should it?" said Mr. Ransome, about to turn in at some un-Palladian metal gates.
"This is it," said Mrs. Ransome, looking at the letter.
The gates were set in a 7-foot-high fence, topped with an oblique pelmet of barbed wire, so that the place looked less like a park than a prison. Fixed to an empty pillbox was a metal diagram, painted in yellow and blue, showing the whereabouts of the various firms on the estate. Mr. Ransome got out to look for Unit 14. "You are here," said an arrow. Only someone had inserted at the tip of the arrow a pair of crudely drawn buttocks. Mr. Ransome got back in the car and drove slowly on in the gathering dusk, until he came to a broad, low, hangar-like building with double sliding doors painted red, and bare of all identification except for a warning that guard dogs patrolled. There were no other cars, and no sign of anybody about. They had almost completed a circuit of the hangar when they came on a small frosted window where there was a dim light. It was open an inch or two at the top, and was obviously a lavatory, and faintly through the glass Mrs. Ransome could see, standing on the window ledge, the blurred shape of a toilet roll. It was doubtless a coincidence that it was blue, and forget-me-not blue at that, a shade Mrs. Ransome always favoured in her own toilet rolls, and which was not always easy to find. She pressed her face to the glass in order to see it more clearly, and then saw something else. "Look, dear," Mrs. Ransome said. But Mr. Ransome wasn't looking. He was listening. "Shut up," he said. He could hear Mozart. And floating through the crack of the lavatory window came the full, dark, sumptuous, and utterly unmistakable tones of Dame Kiri Te Kanawa. Galvanized by the sound of the Antipodean songstress, Mr. Ransome clambered up the fall-pipe and knelt painfully on the window-sill. Clinging to the pipe with one hand, he prized open the window an inch or two further, and forced his head in as far as it would go, almost slipping off the sill in the process. "Careful," said Mrs. Ransome. Mr. Ransome began to shout. "Hello? Hello?" Mozart stopped, and somewhere a bus went by. In the silence, Mr. Ransome shouted again, this time almost joyfully. "Hello?"
Instantly there was bedlam. Dogs burst out barking, a siren went off, and Mr. and Mrs. Ransom were trapped and dazzled by half a dozen security lights focused tightly on their shrinking forms. Petrified, Mr. Ransom clung desperately to the lavatory window, while Mrs. Ransom plastered herself as closely as she could against the wall, one hand creeping, she hoped unobtrusively, up to the window-sill to seek the comfort of Mr. Ransom's knee. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the commotion stopped. The lights went out, the siren trailed off, and the barking of the dogs modulated to an occasional growl. Trembling on the sill, Mr. Ransom heard a door pushed back, and unhurried steps walking across the forecourt. "Sorry about that, people," said a male voice. "Burglars, I'm afraid. Measures for the detection and discouragement of—" Mrs. Ransom peered into the darkness, but still half-blinded by the lights could see nothing. Mr. Ransom slithered down the fall-pipe to stand beside her, and she took his hand. "This way, chaps and chapesses, over here." Mr. and Mrs. Ransom stumbled across the last of the grass onto the concrete, where, silhouetted against the open door, stood a young man. Dazed, they followed him into the hangar, and in the light they made a sorry-looking pair. Mrs. Ransom was limping because one of her heels had broken, and she'd laddered both her stockings. Mr. Ransom had torn the knee of his trousers, and across his forehead, where he'd pressed his face into the window, was a long black smudge. The young man smiled and put out his hand. "Maurice. Rosemary. Hi. I'm Martin." It was a pleasant, open face, and though he did have one of those little beards Mrs. Ransom thought made them all look like poisoners, for a warehouseman, one way and another, he looked quite classy. True, he was wearing the kind of cap which had once been the distinctive headgear of American golfers, but now seemed of general application, and a little squirt of hair with a rubber band round it coming out of the back, and again, like them all nowadays, his shirt-tail was out. Still, what gave him a certain air in Mrs. Ransom's eyes was his smart maroon cardigan. It was not unlike the one she'd picked out for Mr. Ransom at a Simpson's sale the year before. Loosely knotted round his neck was a yellow silk scarf with horses' heads on it. Mrs. Ransom had bought Mr. Ransom one of those too, though he had worn it only once, as he decided it made him look like a cad. It made the young man look dashing, and she thought that if ever they got their belongings back, she'd root the scarf out from the wardrobe and make her husband give it another try. "Follow moi," said the young man, and led them down a cold, uncarpeted corridor. "It's so nice to meet you at long last," he said over his shoulder, "though, in the circumstances, I feel I know you already." "What circumstances?" said Mr. Ransom. "Bear with me one moment," said Martin. "I'll just illuminate matters a fraction," he said, and a light came on in a room beyond. "Come in," said Martin, and he laughed. Tired and dirty and blinking in the light, Mr. and Mrs. Ransom stumbled through the door and into their own flat. It was just as they had left it the evening they had gone to the opera. Here was their carpet, their sofa, their high-backed chairs, the reproduction walnut-veneered coffee table with the scalloped edges and cabriole legs, and on it the latest number of the gramophone. Here was Mrs. Ransom's embroidery, lying on the end of the sofa where she'd put it down before going to change at 5:45 on that never-to-be-forgotten evening. There, on the nest of tables, was the glass from which Mr. Ransom had had a little drop of something to see him through the first act of Così. Still, Mrs. Ransom touched the rim of the glass with her finger, still slightly sticky. On the mantelpiece, the carriage clock, presented to Mr. Ransom to mark his 25 years with the firm of Selby, Ransom, Steel and Company, struck 6, though Mrs. Ransom was not sure if it was 6 then or 6 now. The lights were on, just as they had left them.
Other than a cardboard plate with some cold, half-eaten curry, which Martin neatly heeled under the sofa, mouthing, "Sorry," everything, every little thing, was exactly as it should be. They might have been at home in their flat in Naseby Mansion, St. John's Wood, and not in a hangar on an industrial estate on the outskirts of nowhere. Gone was the feeling of foreboding with which Mrs. Ransome had set out that afternoon. Now there was only joy, as she wandered round the room, occasionally picking up some cherished object with a smile and an "oh" of reacquaintance, sometimes holding it up for her husband to see. For his part, Mr. Ransome was almost moved, particularly when he spotted his old CD player, his trusty old CD player, as he was inclined to think of it now. Not quite up to the mark, it's true, the venerable old thing, but still honest and old-fashioned. Yes, it was good to see it again, and he gave Mrs. Ransome a brief blast of cosy. Watching this reunion with a smile almost of pride, Martin said, "Everything in order? I tried to keep it all just as it was." "Oh, yes," said Mrs. Ransome. "It's perfect." "Astonishing," said her husband. Mrs. Ransome remembered something. "I put a casserole in the oven." "Yes," said Martin, "I enjoyed that." "It wasn't dry," said Mrs. Ransome. "Only a touch," said Martin, following them into the bedroom. "It would perhaps have been better on gas mark 3. Mrs. Ransome nodded, and noticed on the dressing-table the piece of kitchen paper. She remembered how they'd run out of Kleenex, with which she'd blotted her lipstick 3 months before. "Kitchen?" said Martin, as if they might not know the way, though it was exactly where it should have been, and exactly how, too, except that the casserole dish, now empty, stood washed and waiting on the draining-board. "I wasn't sure where that went," said Martin apologetically. "Oh, that's all right," said Mrs. Ransome. "It lives in here." She opened the cupboard by the sink and popped the dish away. "That was my guess," said Martin, though I didn't like to risk it. He laughed, and Mrs. Ransome laughed too. Mr. Ransome scowled. The young man was civil enough, if over-familiar, but it all seemed a bit too relaxed. A crime had been committed, after all, and not a petty one either. This was stolen property. What was it doing here? Mr. Ransome thought it was time to take charge of the situation. "Tea?" said Martin. "No, thank you," said Mr. Ransome. "Lovely," said his wife. "Then," said Martin, "we need to talk." "Perhaps," said Martin, giving Mrs. Ransome her tea, "perhaps you'd like to tell me what this is all about. I mean, with all due respect, as they say." This was too much for Mr. Ransome. "Perhaps," he exploded, "and with all due respect, you'd like to tell me why it is you're wearing my cardigan." "You never wore it much," said Mrs. Ransome placidly. "Lovely tea." "That isn't the point, Rosemary." Mr. Ransome seldom used her Christian name, except as a form of blunt instrument. "And that's my silk scarf." "You never wore that at all. You said it made you look like a cad." "That's why I like it," said Martin happily. "The cad factor. However, all good things come to an end, as they say." "Actually," said Martin, "we've worn one or two of your things. I started off with your brown overcoat, which I just tried on originally as a bit of a joke." "A joke?" said Mr. Ransome, the humorous qualities of that particular garment never having occurred to him. "Yes, only now I've grown quite fond of it. It's brilliant." "But it must be too big for you," said Mrs. Ransome. "I know, that's why it's so great. And you've got tons of scarves. Cleo thinks you've got really good taste." "Cleo?" said Mrs. Ransome. "My partner." Then, catching sight of Mr. Ransome, by now pop-eyed with fury, Martin shrugged. "After all, it was you who gave us the green light." He went into the sitting-room and came back with a folder, which he laid on the kitchen table. "Just tell me," said Mr. Ransome with terrible calmness, "why it is our things are here." So Martin explained. Except it wasn't really an explanation, and when he'd finished, they weren't much further on. He had come into work one morning about 3 months ago, February the 15th, Mrs. Ransome supplied helpfully, and unlocking the doors, had found their flat set out just as it had been in Naseby Mansions, and just as they saw it now, carpets down, lights on, warm, a smell of cooking from the kitchen. "But surely," Mr. Ransome said, "you must have realised that this was, to say the least, unusual." "Very unusual," said Martin. "Normally," he said, "home contents were containered, crated and sealed, and the container parked in the back lot until required. We store loads of furniture, but I might go for 6 months and never see an armchair." "But why were they all dumped here?" said Mrs. Ransome. "Dumped," said Martin. "You call this dumped? It's beautiful. It's a poem." "Why?" said Mr. Ransome. "Well, when I came in that morning there was an envelope on the hall table." "Which is where I put the letters normally," said Mrs. Ransome. "An envelope," said Martin, "containing £3,000 cash to cover storage costs for 2 months. Well clear of our normal charges, I can tell you. And," said Martin, taking a card out of the folder, "there was this." It was a sheet torn from the Delia Smith cookery calendar, with a recipe for the hot pot which Mrs. Ransome had made that afternoon and which she'd left in the oven. On the back of it was written, "Leave exactly as it is," then in brackets, "but feel free to use." This was underlined. "So, where your overcoat was concerned and the scarves, etc., I felt—" Martin searched for the right word. "I felt that this was my imprimatur." He had been briefly at the University of Warwick. "But anybody could have written that," Mr. Ransome said. "And leave £3,000 in cash with it," said Martin. "No fear. Only I did check. Newport Pagnell knew nothing about it. Cardiff, Leeds. I had it run through the computer and they drew a complete blank. So I thought, well, Martin, the stuff's here. For the time being it's paid for, so why not just make yourself at home? So I did. I could have done with the choice of CDs being a bit more eclectic, though my guess is you're a Mozart fan." "I still think," said Mr. Ransome testily, "you might have made more inquiries before making so free with our belongings." "It's not usual, I agree," said Martin. "Only why should I? I'd no reason to— Smell a rat?" Mr. Ransome took in and was irritated by these occasional notes of inappropriate interrogation, with which Martin, and the young generally, seemed often to end sentences. Martin, on the other hand, seemed unconscious of the irritation he was causing. His serenity so impervious, Mr. Ransome put it down to drugs. And while Mr. Ransome fussed round the flat on the lookout for evidence of damage or dilapidation, or even undue wear and tear, Martin chatted comfortably to Rosemary, as he called her. "It's been like playing houses," said Martin. "Cleo and I live over a dry cleaner's normally." Mrs. Ransome thought Cleo might be black, but she didn't like to ask. "Actually," and Martin dropped his voice because Mr. Ransome was in the pantry cupboard counting the bottles of wine on the rack, "actually it's perked things up between us two. Change of scene? Know what they say?" Mrs. Ransome nodded knowledgeably. It was a topic frequently touched on in the afternoon programmes. "Good bed," whispered Martin. "The mattress gives you lots of— what's the word? Purchase?" Martin gave a little thrust with his hips. "Know what I mean, Rosemary?" He winked. "It's orthopaedic," Mrs. Ransome said hastily. "Mr. Ransome has a bad back." "I'd probably have one too if I lived here much longer." Martin patted her hand. "Only joking." "What I don't understand," said Mr. Ransome, coming into the kitchen while Martin still had his hand over his wife's— Mr. Ransome didn't understand that either—
What I don't understand is how whoever it was transported our things here could remember so exactly where everything went."
"Trouble ye no more," said Martin,
and he went out into the hall and brought back a photograph album. It was a present Mr. Ransome had bought Mrs. Ransome when he was urging her to find a hobby. Here were a dozen or so photographs of every room in the flat on the night in question. General views of the room, corners of the room, a close-up of the mantelpiece, another of the desk top. Every room and every surface recorded in conscientious detail, much as if, had the flat been the setting for a film, the continuity assistant would have recorded them. "And our name and address?" Mr. Ransome said. "Simple," said Martin. "Open any drawer," he and Mrs. Ransome said together. "Well, I don't think we need to prolong this stage of the proceedings any longer than we have to," said Mr. Ransome. "I'll contact my insurance company and tell them our belongings have been found. They will then doubtless contact you over their collection and return. There doesn't seem to be anything missing, but at this stage one can't be sure." "Oh, there's nothing missing," said Martin. "One or two after-eights, perhaps, but I can easily replenish those." "No, no," said Mrs. Ransome, "that won't be necessary. They're—" and she smiled, "they're on the house." Mr. Ransome frowned, and when Martin went off to find the various pro formas, he whispered to Mrs. Ransome that they would have to have everything cleaned. "I don't like to think what's been going on. There was a bit of kitchen paper on your dressing-table with what was almost certainly blood, and I've a feeling they may have been sleeping in our bed." Standing on the forecourt as they were going, Martin kissed Mrs. Ransome on both cheeks. He was about the age their son would have been, Mrs. Ransome thought, had they had a son. "I feel like I'm one of the family," he said. Yes, thought Mr. Ransome, if they'd had a son, this is what it would have been like. Irritating, perplexing, feeling got at. They wouldn't have been able to call their lives their own. Mr. Ransome managed to shake hands. Martin patted his shoulder. "Take care." "How do we know he wasn't in on it?" said Mr. Ransome in the car. "He doesn't look the type," said Mrs. Ransome. "Oh, what type is that? Have you ever come across a case like this before? Have you ever heard of it? What type does it take? That's what I'd like to know." "We're going a little fast," said Mrs. Ransome. "I shall have to inform the police, of course," Mr. Ransome said. "They weren't interested before, so they'll be even less interested now." "Who are you?" "Beg pardon?" "I'm the solicitor. Who are you? Are you the expert?" They drove in silence for a while. "Of course, I shall want some compensation. The distress, the agony of mind, the inconvenience, they're all quantifiable and must be taken into account in the final settlement." He was already writing the letter in his head. In due course the contents of the flat came back to Naseby Mansions, a card pinned to one of the crates saying, "Feel free to use, Martin," and in brackets, "Joke." Mr. Ransome insisted that everything must be put back just as it had been before, which might have proved difficult had it not been for the aide-memoire in the form of Mrs. Ransome's photograph album. Even so, the gang who returned the furniture were less meticulous than the burglars who'd removed it, besides being much slower. Still, the flat having been decorated throughout, and the covers washed, hoovered, or dry-cleaned, the place gradually came to look much as it had done before, and life returned to what Mrs. Ransome used to think of as normal, but didn't now, quite. Early on in the proceedings, and while Mr. Ransome was at the office, Mrs. Ransome tried out her cane rocking-chair and rug in the now much less Spartan conditions of the lounge, but though the chair was as comfortable as ever, the ensemble didn't look right, and made her feel she was sitting in a department store. So she relegated the chair to the spare room, where from time to time she visited it and sat reviewing her life. But no, it was not the same, and eventually she put the chair out for the caretaker. Mr. Ransome fared better than his wife, for although he had to reimburse the insurance company over their original cheque, he was able to claim that having already ordered some new speakers, he hadn't, this should be taken into account and allowance made, which it duly was, thus enabling him to invest in some genuinely state-of-the-art equipment. From time to time over the next few months, traces of Martin and Cleo's brief occupation would surface. A contraceptive packet, empty, that had been thrust under the mattress, a handkerchief down the side of the settee, and, in one of the mantelpiece ornaments, a lump of hard brown material wrapped in silver paper. Tentatively, Mrs. Ransome sniffed it, then donned her marigold gloves and flushed it down the lavatory, assuming that was where it belonged, though it was only after several goes that it was reluctantly flushed. Strange hairs were another item that put in regular appearances, long fair ones which were obviously Martin's, darker crinklier ones that she supposed must be Cleo's. The incidence of these hairs wasn't split evenly between Mr. and Mrs. Ransome's respective wardrobes. Indeed, since Mr. Ransome didn't complain about them, she presumed he never found any, as he would certainly have let her know if he had. She, on the other hand, found them everywhere, among her dresses, her coats, her underwear, his hairs as well as hers, and little ones as well as long ones, so that she was left puzzling over what it was they could have been up to that wasn't constrained by the normal boundaries of gender and propriety. Had Martin worn her knickers on his head, she wondered? In one pair there were 3 hairs. Had the elastic on her brassiere always been as loose as it was now? 2 hairs there, one fair, one dark. Still, sitting opposite Mr. Ransome in his earphones of an evening, she could contemplate with equanimity, and even a small thrill, that she had shared her underclothes with a third party. Or 2 third parties, possibly. "You don't mean a third party," Mr. Ransome would have said, but this was another argument for keeping quiet. There was one reminder of the recent past that Mr. and Mrs. Ransome were forced to share, if only by accident. They had had their supper one Saturday evening, after which Mr. Ransome was planning to record a live broadcast of Il Seraglio on Radio 3. He had put in a tape that he thought was blank, but checking it on the machine was startled to find that it began with a peal of helpless laughter. Mrs. Ransome looked up. Mr. Ransome listened long enough to detect that there were 2 people laughing, a man and a woman, and since they showed no sign of stopping, was about to switch it off, when Mrs. Ransome said, "No, Morris, leave it. This might be a clue." So they listened in silence as the laughter went on, almost uninterrupted, until, after 3 or 4 minutes, it began to slacken and break up, and whoever it was who was laughing was left panting and breathless, this breathlessness gradually modulating into another sound, the second subject, as it were, a groan, and then a cry, leading to a rhythmic pumping as stern and as purposeful as the other had been silly and light-hearted. At one point the microphone was moved closer, to catch a sound that was so moist and wet it hardly seemed human. "It sounds," said Mrs. Ransome, "like custard boiling," though she knew that it wasn't. Making custard must seldom be so effortful as this seemed to be, nor is the custard urged on with affirmative yells, nor do the cooks cry out when, in due course, the custard starts to boil over. "I don't think we want to listen to this, do we?" Mr. Ransome said, and switched over to Radio 3, where they came in on the reverent hush that preceded the arrival of Claudio Abbado. Later, when they were in bed, Mrs. Ransome said, "I suppose we'd better return that tape." "What for?" said Mr. Ransome. "The tape is mine. In any case we can't. It's wiped. I recorded over it." This was a lie. Mr. Ransome had wanted to record over it, it's true, but felt that whenever he listened to the music he would remember what lay underneath, and that this would put paid to any possible sublimity. So he had dropped the tape in the kitchen bin. Then, thinking about it as Mrs. Ransome was in the bathroom brushing her teeth,
he went back and delved among the potato peelings and old tea-bags, and picking off a tomato skin that had stuck to it, he hid the cassette in the bookcase behind a copy of Salmon on Torts, a hidey-hole where he also kept a cache of photographs of some suburban sexual acts, the legacy of a messy divorce case in Epsom he'd conducted a few years before. The bookcase had of course gone to Aylesbury along with everything else, but had been returned intact, the hiding-place seemingly undetected by Martin. Actually, it had not been undetected at all. The photographs had been what he and Cleo had been laughing about on the tape in the first place. Not a secret from Martin, nor were the snaps a secret from Mrs. Ransome, who, idly looking at the bookcase one afternoon and wondering what to cook for supper, had seen the title Salmon on Torts and thought it had a vaguely culinary sound to it. She had put the photographs back undisturbed, but every few months or so would check to see that they were still there. When they were, she felt somehow reassured. So sometimes now, when Mr. Ransome sat in his chair with his earphones on, listening to Magic Flute, it was not Magic Flute he was listening to at all. His ears were full of Martin and Cleo moaning and crying and taking it out on one another again and again and again. No matter how often he listened to the tape, Mr. Ransome never ceased to be amazed by it. The two human beings could give themselves up so utterly and unreservedly to one another and to the moment was beyond his comprehension. It seemed to him miraculous. Listening to the tape so often, he became every bit as familiar with it as with something by Mozart. He came to recognise Martin's long intake of breath as marking the end of a mysterious bridging passage. Cleo was actually on her hands and knees, Martin behind her, when the languorous andante, little mewings from the girl, accelerated into the percussive allegro assai, hoarse cries from them both, which in its turn gave way to an even more frantic coda, a sudden rallentando. "No, no, not yet," she was crying. Then "Yes, yes, yes," followed by panting, sighing, silence, and finally sleep. Not an imaginative man, Mr. Ransome nevertheless found himself thinking that if one built up a library of such tapes, it would be possible to bestow on them the sexual equivalent of Kirkle numbers, even trace the development of some sort of style in sexual intercourse, with early, middle, and late periods, the whole apparatus of Mozartian musicology adapted to these new and thwacking rhythms. Such were Mr. Ransome's thoughts as he sat across from his wife. She knew he wasn't listening to Mozart, though there were few obvious signs, and nothing so vulgar as a bulge in his trousers. No, there was just a look of strain on Mr. Ransome's face, which was the very opposite of the look he had when he was listening to his favourite composer, an intensity of attention and a sense that, were he to listen hard enough, he might hear something on the tape he had previously missed. Mrs. Ransome would listen to the tape herself from time to time, but lacking the convenient camouflage of Mozart, she confined her listening experiences to the afternoons. Getting out her folding household steps, she would pull down Salmon on Torts, then reach in behind it for the tape. Then, having poured herself a small sherry, she would settle down to listen to them making love, marvelling still after at least a dozen hearings at the length and persistence of the process, and its violent and indecorous outcome. Afterwards, she would go and lie on the bed, reflecting that this was the same bed on which it had all happened, and think again about it happening. These discreet epiphanies apart, life, after they had recovered their possessions, went on much the same as before they lost them. Sometimes, though, lying there on the bed or waiting to get up in the morning, Mrs. Ransome would get depressed, feeling she had missed the bus, though what bus it was or where it was headed she would have found it hard to say. Prior to the visit to Aylesbury and the return of their things, she had, she thought, persuaded herself that the burglary had been an opportunity, with each day bringing its crop of small adventures. A visit from Dusty, a walk down to Mr. Anwar's, a trip up the Edgware Road. Now, re-ensconced among her possessions, Mrs. Ransome feared that her diversions were at an end. Life had returned to normal, but it was a normal she no longer relished or was contented with. The afternoons particularly were dull and full of regret. It's true she continued to watch the television, no longer so surprised at what people got up to as she once had been, but even, as with Martin and Cleo, mildly envious. She grew so accustomed to the forms of television discourse that she occasionally let slip a telltale phrase herself, remarking once, for instance, that there had been a bit of hassle on the 74 bus. "Hassle?" said Mr. Ransome. "Where did you pick up that expression?" "Why," said Mrs. Ransome innocently, "isn't it a proper word?" "Not in my vocabulary." It occurred to Mrs. Ransome that this was the time for counselling. Previously an option, it had now become a necessity, so she tried to reach Dusty via her helpline. "I'm sorry, but Ms. Briscoe is not available to take your call," said a recorded voice, which was immediately interrupted by a real presence. "Hello, Mandy speaking. How may I help you?" Mrs. Ransome explained that she needed to talk to somebody about the sudden return of all the stolen property. "I have complicated feelings about it," said Mrs. Ransome, and tried to explain. Mandy was doubtful. "It might come under post-traumatic stress syndrome," she said, "only I wouldn't bank on it. They're clamping down on that now we're coming to the end of this financial year, and anyway it's meant for rape and murder and what-not, whereas we've had people ringing up who've just had a bad time at the dentist's." "Never mind," said Mrs. Ransome. "I expect I shall cope." "Well, that's what we all have to do in the end, isn't it?" said Mandy. "What's that?" said Mrs. Ransome. "Cope, dear. After all, that's the name of the game. And the way you've described it," Mandy said, "it seems a very caring burglary." Mandy was right, though it was the caringness that was the problem. Had this been a burglary in the ordinary way, it would have been easier to get over. Even the comprehensive removal of everything they had in the world was something Mrs. Ransome could have adjusted to, been positive about, even enjoyed. But it was the wholesale disappearance, coupled with the meticulous reconstruction and return, that rankled. Who would want to rob them to that degree, and having robbed them, would choose to make such immaculate reparation? It seemed to Mrs. Ransome that she had been robbed twice over, by the loss first of her possessions, then of her chance to transcend that loss. It was not fair, nor did it make sense. She thought perhaps this was what they meant when they talked about losing the plot. People seldom wrote to the Ransomes. They had the occasional card from Canada, where Mr. Ransome had some relatives of his mother who dutifully kept up the connection. Mrs. Ransome would write back, her card as flavourless as theirs, the message from Canada little more than, "Hello, we are still here," and her reply, "Yes, and so are we." Generally, though, the post consisted of bills and business communications, and picking them up from the box downstairs in the lobby, Mrs. Ransome scarcely bothered to look them through, putting them unsifted on the hall table, where Mr. Ransome would deal with them before he had his supper. On this particular morning she just completed this ritual when she noticed that the letter on the top was from South America, and that it was not addressed to Mr. M. Ransome, but to a Mr. M. Hanson. This had happened once before, Mr. Ransome putting the redirected letter in the caretaker's box with a note, asking him or the postman to be more careful in future. Less tolerant of her husband's fussing than she once had been, Mrs. Ransome didn't want this performance again, so she put the letter on one side so that after her lunch she could go up to the 8th floor, find Mr. Hanson's door, and slip it underneath. At least it would be an outing. It was several years since she'd been up to the top of the mansions. There had been some alteration, she knew, as Mr. Ransome had had to write a letter of complaint to the landlords about the noise of the workmen and the dirt in the lift. But as tenants came and went, someone was always having something done somewhere, and Mrs. Ransome came to take renovation as a fact of life. Still, venturing out of the lift, she was surprised how airy it all was now. It might have been a modern building, so light and unshadowed and spacious was this top landing. Nor was it simply the decoration that had changed. Mrs. Ransome remembered there being several flats, but now there seemed to be only one, no trace of the other doors remaining. She looked for a name on this one door, just to be sure, but there was no name, and no letterbox. She bent down, intending to slip the letter from South America underneath, but the carpet was so thick that this was difficult, and it wouldn't go. She was trying to press the pile of the carpet down when there was a faint buzz, and the door swung silently open. "Come in," said a disembodied voice, and holding up the letter as if it were an invitation, Mrs. Ransome went in. There was no one in the hall, and she waited uncertainly, smiling helpfully in case someone was watching. "I brought a letter," she said, more loudly than if there'd been someone there. "It came by mistake." There was no sound. "I think it's from South America, Peru. That is if the name's Hanson. Anyway," she said desperately, I'll just pop it down and then go." She was about to put the letter down on a cube of transparent perspex that she took to be a table, when she heard behind her an exhausted sigh, and turned to find that the door had closed. But as the door behind her closed, so with a mild intake of breath the door in front of her opened, and through it she saw another doorway, this one with a bar across the top, and suspended from the bar, a young man. The young man was pulling himself up to the bar, seemingly without much effort, and saying his score out loud. He was wearing grey tracksuit bottoms and earphones, and that was all. Mrs. Ransome thought she had never seen anyone so beautiful in all her life. "I brought a letter," she began again. "It came by mistake." She held it out to him, but he made no move to take it, so she looked round for somewhere to put it down. There was a long refectory table down the middle of the room, and by the wall a sofa that was nearly as long, but these were the only objects in the room that Mrs. Ransome would have called proper furniture. There were some brightly coloured plastic cubes scattered about, which she supposed might serve as occasional tables, or possibly stools. There was a tall pyramid with vents, which seemed to be a standard lamp. There was an old-fashioned pram with white-walled tyres and huge curved springs. On one wall was a dray horse collar, and on another a cavalier's hat, and next to it a huge blown-up photograph of Lana Turner. He saw her looking. "It's been in magazines," he said. "Sit down," and he took the letter from her. He sat at one end of the sofa, and she sat at the other. He looked at the letter, turning it over once or twice without opening it. "It's from Peru," Mrs. Ransome said. "Yes," he said, "thanks," and tore it in two. "It might be important," said Mrs. Ransome. "It's always important," said the young man, and dropped the pieces onto the carpet. He felt in his armpit, then waved an arm at the room. "This is all her." "Who?" He indicated the torn-up letter. "She did the place up. She's an interior decorator, or was. She now ranches in Peru." "She did the place up," he said. "Then, of course, she moved in." "So you felt," said Mrs. Ransome, and the phrase might have been her first faltering steps in Urdu, it seemed so strange on her lips. "You felt that she had invaded your space." "She did. She did. I mean, take the pram." "I remember those," said Mrs. Ransome. "Yes, well, sure. Only apparently," he said, "though it wasn't apparent to me, that is not there as a pram. It is there as an object, and it had to be just on that spot, and because I happened to move it like half an inch, Madam went to spare. Threatened to take everything away. Leave the place bare. As if I cared. Anyway, she's history.
When did she leave you?
I don't know. I lose track of time. 3 months, 4 months ago. Like February, said Mrs. Ransome. And it wasn't a question. Right. Hanson, Ransome, she said. They're not really alike, but I suppose if you're from Peru... He didn't understand, as why should he? So she told him the whole story, beginning with them coming back from the opera and the police and the trek out to Aylesbury, the whole tale. When she'd finished, he said, "Yeah, that sounds like Paloma. It's the kind of thing she would do. She had a funny sense of humour." "Who'd she have got to do it with such care?" Mrs. Ransome asked. "Oh, that's easy. Roadies. Guys who do set-ups. Picked the lock, took the photographs, dismantled your set-up, put it up again in Aylesbury. A designer job, probably. They're doing it all the time, one way and another. No problem. Nothing too much trouble. Provided," he winked, "you pay extra." She could pay. She was rich. "Anyway," he said, getting up from the sofa and taking her hand, "I'm sorry you've been inconvenienced on my account." "No," said Mrs. Ransome. "It was, well, you know, kind of weird to begin with, but I've tried to be positive about it, and I think I've grown, you know." They were standing by the pram. "We had one of these once," Mrs. Ransome said, briefly. It was something she had not spoken of for 30 years. "A baby?" "He was going to be called Donald," Mrs. Ransome said, "but he never got that far." Unaware that a revelation had been made, the young man stroked his nipple reflectively as he walked her out into the hall. "Thank you for clearing up the mystery," she said, and, the boldest thing she'd ever done in her life, touched him lightly on his bare hip. She was prepared for him to flinch, but he didn't, nor was there any change in his demeanour, which was still smiling and relaxed, except that he also must have thought something out of the ordinary was called for, because, taking her hand, he raised it to his lips and kissed it. End of story, or so Mrs. Ransome thought, except that one Sunday afternoon, a couple of months later, Mr. Ransome suffered a stroke. Mrs. Ransome was in the kitchen, stacking the dishwasher, and hearing a bump went in and found her husband lying in front of the bookcase, a cassette in one hand, a dirty photograph in the other, and salmon on torch open on the floor. Mr. Ransome was conscious, but could neither speak nor move. Mrs. Ransome did all the right things, placing a cushion under his head and a rug over his body before ringing the ambulance. She hoped that even in his stricken state her efficiency and self-possession would impress her prostrate husband, but looking down at him while she was waiting to be connected to the appropriate service, she saw in his eyes no sign of approval or gratitude, just a look of sheer terror. Powerless to draw his wife's attention to the cassette clutched in his hand, or even to relinquish it, her helpless husband watched as Mrs. Ransome briskly collected up the photographs, with something at the very back of his mind registering how little interest or surprise was occasioned by this tired old smut. Lastly, the klaxon of the ambulance already audible as it raced by the park, she knelt beside him and prized the cassette free of his waxen fingers before popping it matter-of-factly into her apron pocket. Mr. Ransome has not come well out of this narrative. Seemingly impervious to events, he has, unlike his wife, neither changed nor grown in stature. A hobby would have helped, a hobby other than Mozart, that is, the quest for the perfect performance only serving to emphasise Mr. Ransome's punctiliousness and general want of warmth. No. To learn to take things as they come, he would have been better employed in the untidier arts, photography, say, or painting watercolours. A family would have been untidy too, and though it seems it was only Mrs. Ransome who felt the loss of baby Donald, and though Mr. Ransome would have been no joke as a father, a son might have knocked the corners off him a little, and made life messier. Tidiness and order now all that mattered to him in middle age. When you come down to it, what he is being condemned for here is not having got out of his shell, and had there been a child, there might have been no shell. Now he lies dumb and unmoving in intensive care, and shell seems to describe it pretty well. Somewhere he can hear his wife's voice, near but at the same time distant and echoing a little, as if his ear was a shell too, and he a creature in it. The nurses have told Mrs. Ransome that he can certainly hear what she is saying, and thinking that he may not survive not so much the stroke as the shame and humiliation that attended it, Mrs. Ransome concentrates on clearing that up first. If we can get on a more sensible footing in the sex department, she thinks, we may end up regarding this stroke business as a blessing. So, feeling a little foolish that the conversation has of necessity to be wholly one-sided, Mrs. Ransome begins to talk to her inert husband, or rather, since there are other patients in the ward, murmur in his ear. She tells him how she has known about what she calls his silliness for years, and that there is nothing to feel ashamed of, for it's only sex after all. Inside his shell, Mr. Ransome is trying to think what ashamed is, and even feeling he's no longer quite sure about, let alone sex. Words seem to have come unstuck from their meanings. Having been sensible about Mr. Ransome's silliness just about brings Mrs. Ransome to the end of her emotional vocabulary. Still, Mr. Ransome, though numb, is at the same time hurting, and they plainly need to talk. So, holding his limp hand lightly in hers, Mrs. Ransome begins to whisper to him in that language which she can see now she was meant to acquire for just this sort of eventuality. She talks about perspectives and sex, and how it can go on joyful and unrestrained until the very brink of the grave, and she adumbrates a future of which this will be a part, and how once he gets back on his feet they will set aside quality time, which they will devote to touching one another. We have never hugged, Maurice. In the future we must hug one another. Festooned as he is with tubes and drains and monitors, hugging Mr. Ransome ill is no easier than hugging Mr. Ransome well, so Mrs. Ransome contents herself with kissing his hand. But having shared with him her vision of the future, tactile, communicative, convivial, she now thinks to top it off with some cosy. It might just do the trick, she thinks. So, careful not to dislodge any of Mr. Ransome's many wires, which are not channels of entertainment at all, Mrs. Ransome gently positions the earphones on his head. Before slipping the cassette into the player, she holds it before his unblinking eyes. "Così," she articulates, and more loudly, "Mozart." She switches it on, scanning her husband's unchanging face for any sign of response. There is none. She turns the volume up a little, but not loud, mezzo forte, say. Mr. Ransome, who has heard the word Mozart without knowing whether it is a person or a thing, or even an articulated lorry, now cringes motionless before a barrage of sounds that are to him utterly meaningless, that have no more pattern or sense than the leaves on a tree. Only the leaves on the tree seem to be the notes, and there is someone in the tree. It is Dame Kitty, shrieking. It is baffling, it is terrible, it is loud. Perhaps it is this last awful realization that Mozart does not make sense, or it is because Mrs. Ransome, finding there is still no response, decides to up the volume still further, just as a last shot, that the sound vibrates in Mr. Ransome's ears, and it is the vibration that does it. But at any rate, something happens in his head, and the frail sack into which the blood has leaked now bursts,
and Mr. Ransome hears, louder and more compelling than any music he has ever heard before, a roaring in his ears, and there is a sudden and brief andante. He coughs quietly and dies. Marriage had often seemed a kind of parenthesis to Mrs. Ransome, so it's fitting that what she says to the nurse, "I think he's gone," is here in parenthesis too, and that it is this last little parenthesis that brings the larger parenthesis to a close. And so, the brackets close that opened 32 years before. Mrs. Ransome goes home, a widow. Then there is a fitting pause. And television having schooled her in the processes of bereavement and the techniques of grieving, Mrs. Ransome observes that pause. She gives herself ample time to mourn and to come to terms with her loss, and generally speaking, where widowhood is concerned, she does not put a foot wrong. It seems to her, as she looks back, that the burglary and everything that has happened since has been a kind of apprenticeship. Now, she thinks, I can start.